Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the Clue of the Black Keys. So, this is the 28th book in the series, and it was first published in 1951. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting so excited to get higher up in the books because we're getting closer to the books that were written in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and on, and those are some of my absolute favorites. I love some of the original Yellow Spines, but I'm so excited to get to some of the more modern books too. So as far as book covers go, there's two book covers for The Clue of the Black Keys, and actually the first one, that Nancy looks like she's been recycled off the cover of The Secret of Redgate Farm. She's wearing a very similar pink sweater, and they're studying this slab, this thing, I don't know, it's supposed to be sort of like a Rosetta Stone type of thing. It unlocks the, clues to a lost civilization, but I'm not really sure who the people in this book cover are. I'm assuming it's the other professors that Nancy deals with, but they look like they're in the thick, heart of the jungle. Although I know for a fact that they're just in Florida, and that is one of my biggest gripes with this book, is that it's over Nancy's head the entire time. We're going to go to Mexico, and then they never go to Mexico. They just go to Florida. But anyway, it's obviously, this is Florida on the cover of this, I guess. Now, the second edition, the revised cover, shows Nancy with red hair. It's flipped out. This is her signature look on the revised covers. And again, we're in this jungle-like atmosphere. There is a big, treasure chest that's kind of half buried in the background. And then there's this creepy-looking man in a pink, Hawaiian-type shirt and a, hat. He looks like Crocodile Dundee or something. So I forgot what my funny cover spoof was, and apparently I thought this was a good one because I said the mystery of why does Crocodile Dundee have a staring problem? Because he's kind of just leering out of the bushes and trees at Nancy, and it's a little bit creepy. So as far as rating these book covers went, I was apparently not feeling it because I just gave it one magnifying glass. And I mean, the revised, I actually like it better than the original. It just has more mystery and intrigue to it. But yeah, I went with one magnifying glass because there's covers that I like a lot more, like the one we previously did in last episode, The Secret of the Wooden Lady. Now, as far as characters go for this book, there is Terrence Scott, who is a professor that Nancy kind of she doesn't really flirt with him. I think he flirts more with her, but he's in this book, and Ned is insanely jealous of him. There is Dr. Graham, Dr. Pitt, and Dr. Anderson, other respective professors that work with Terrence Scott. There is Juarez Tino, which, okay, what a name, and Wilfred Porterly, who is a sidekick to this guy. They're both real bad guys. We'll find out about that in a minute. And the Wangles. That is their name, the Wangles. And I keep wanting to say the Waddells. I discussed in a previous episode, I don't know. I think I hear these names and I think that is made up. That is not a real name. And my brain tries to rearrange it into a more common sounding name. But yeah, the Wangles. So without further ado, let's jump right into the synopsis for this book. Nancy is met by Professor Terrence Scott at the airport, a man who says he has a mystery for her. On a recent archaeological dig in Mexico, he and some other professors found a cipher they are convinced will lead them to a treasure, but Dr. Pitt and the cipher disappear. A man at the airport tries to steal Terrence Scott's coat with the cipher key in it, and Nancy chases him, but later finds the key wedged into the slats of the bench the coat was on. The professor insists Nancy hold on to the key. That same night, someone breaks into the Drews' home but doesn't find the key. Terrence later explains to Bess and Nancy he thinks the treasure the key will lead them to is some silver frogs. Carson is a bit hesitant about Nancy trusting Terry and taking the case, so he makes her visit Dr. Anderson and Dr. Graham to make sure they vouch for him first. They vouch for him, so Nancy proceeds. Several burglaries are attempted on Nancy's home to steal the key, and then she saves Terry from the Wangles' house where he was imprisoned. Nancy goes on an expedition to Florida with Dr. Anderson and follows a lead for the Black Keys, and helps the professor find the treasure. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is "Long Lost Treasure Belonging to Mexico Found, Facilitated by American Teen Sleuth." So I wrote down several things that stuck out to me in this book, and we'll jump right into them now. So a man tries to steal Terrence Scott's coat with this antique key/cipher thing in it, and the chase ensues. So Nancy grabs Terrence and a police officer, and they get in her car, and she does a U-turn chasing the thief before he drives his car onto the runway. Like, he's just gonna go onto the tarmac. Does not care at all. So the man that was driving is named Wilfred Porterly, and he was driving Juarez Tino, and he claims he didn't know the man, that he begged for a ride, and he grabbed the wheel, causing them to go on the tarmac. And he also says he sells citrus fruit for the Tropical Sun Fruit Company of Florida. The policeman who's interrogating him says, "Sell all the grapefruit you want, but behave yourself." I just thought that was funny. So Terrence Scott gets a ride from Nancy to his hotel and asks her to hold on to the key. And Bess and George start to tease Nancy, and Nancy admits that he's handsome. So there is that. It seems like in the Nancy Drew books, at least in the originals, there's always these like brief flirtations that last for just that one mystery, and like Ned gets insanely jealous if he knows about it, and then Nancy, I don't know, just like drops it. But it's funny how she does admit that he's handsome. So the next note that I took down is Nancy gets woken up by Hannah, and there's a burglar in the house, and they find evidence that someone snuck in a window by the piano, but they're gone. And also the Drews have a piano, because I didn't know that. I think so far the information that we've gotten about the Drews' home is that it's 3 stories. There's a rec room, there's a guest room on the 3rd floor, there's a modern pink and white kitchen, and they have a piano. And I think they have like a tree-lined driveway. So anyways, there's this burglar that gets in, and they get out by the window near the piano, and Hannah says Togo would have been good to have around, but he's on a 3-week vacation with Eloise Drew. So even Togo gets a vacation. Like, what the heck? So the next thing that I wrote down is Bess comments that Ned will be jealous of Terry. And, I mean, she's not wrong. He does get jealous of Terry, but it's funny that Bess picks up on this before Nancy does. Nancy is, like, so hopelessly oblivious to the opposite sex. So, another kind of interesting thing that I took note of is this is the first time that Carson says he doesn't want Nancy to take a case, but his reasoning is that he knows Dr. Pitt, the missing professor, left all his assets to Terry, because Carson happened to be the one that wrote up his will. So he wants to make sure that Terry is like above board and everything, and he isn't lying to Nancy. And it turns out that Terry is telling the truth, so Carson gives his okay, and Nancy's able to take the case. So this next thing is just funny, but Ned asks Nancy if she's forgotten their date that weekend, and Nancy says, "I haven't forgotten. I've got a marvelous memory for dates, especially when they're for house parties." And all the Her Interactive game fans who have played Sea of Darkness are like, yeah, we beg to differ. Nancy forgets anniversaries, all kinds of stuff. If it has to do with Ned, she forgets it. She's honestly like the worst girlfriend. So Terry takes Nancy to lunch, and when she asks about Juarez Tino's wife, he says, "You wouldn't like her, Nancy. She wears loud clothes and always makes herself conspicuous. She has a bold manner and her voice is harsh." So in other words, she wears neon hot pants and speaks her mind. So, another note, Nancy and Terry almost die when Nancy crashes her car in a ditch, and 2 men spying on them at the restaurant moved a roadwork sign. So, she didn't see the sign, and she drove too fast and went into this ditch. And when they get going on the way to Emerson again, Terry says, "You relax and pamper that head of yours, or you won't be able to show up at the dance tomorrow. I'm counting on at least 1 dance with you, young lady." Like, what? Excuse me? Like, I think that this guy, he's a professor, so he's obviously got to be in his, like, mid-20s, maybe? I mean, he's definitely older than Nancy. But there is this running gag because Ned asked Nancy to drive Terry up to the fraternity because he's a fraternity brother from Emerson. And so Ned thinks that he's in his 60s. He doesn't realize that he's younger. And then when he realizes that he is, he gets so jealous. So my next note is Nancy and Ned visit Dr. Anderson, and he talks about Florida, saying, "Great country, Florida." And I was like, I know that we're all aware that Florida is a state, but I've heard people wax poetic about different parts of our country, but I just thought this was a weird thing to say. Now, we also got a context clue about what time of year it is because Nancy asks Ned about his Thanksgiving plans, so I thought that was cool. So this next note is about Bess and George, and Nancy asks them to do some snooping for her and follow Porterly, and they overhear him talking about Nancy, and they're sure that he and maybe Juarez Tino moved the road sign, so they're the ones that basically almost killed Nancy. Now, my next note has to do with the Wangles. They came back into the picture, but they're a family that the Drews don't trust, and they try to hire Terry to translate a diary that might have to do with Mexico, but Nancy advises him against it, and because they were once part of, like, an art forging scheme. Of course, Terry thinks he knows better, and he doesn't listen to Nancy, but we'll get to that in a second. My next note says, Hannah gets hurt by her own burglar alarm system when someone breaks into the house. So she just goes MacGyver and she rigs up these pots and pans on clotheslines at the doors and windows all around the Drews household, which that seems hilarious to me. But all I can think the whole time is like, we got an alarm system put in at the Drews house during Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion. Why are we, like, hanging up all the Wolfgang Puck pots everywhere? I don't understand. But Nancy does find a note on the floor that the burglar dropped, and it says, "No more interference or there will be trouble for you." And then there's some coded notes in the bushes that she found, so she did find some more evidence, but I don't know why Hannah had to, like, rig a bunch of pots and pans everywhere. So Bess comes to check on Nancy and Hannah because they're home alone. Carson's out of the picture at the moment, and she comments, "I can't believe my eyes. You in that apron," and Hannah sitting on the sun porch reading at 9 in the morning because Nancy's like taking over some of the housekeeperly duties because, you know, Hannah got beamed in the head with a pot, so she's not feeling up to making breakfast. My next note says Nancy starts giving Terry tips on how to be a detective and says, "I'm afraid a good detective has to snoop." She also correctly deciphers the coded notes that she found in the bushes, and these lead her to the phone number and address of the Wangles. So she takes the diary pages that Terry translated for them, and she sees that they form a picture of keys and symbols. So she's really getting somewhere. And her and Carson were definitely right to suspect the Wangles because Nancy hears later that Terry hasn't been at his hotel in 2 days, and when she returns from Baltimore with her dad, she discovers he's been held captive at the Wangles, like up in their attic. So Nancy brings Terry home, and Hannah says, "You leave him to me. I know what he needs." We all need a Hannah in our life. Like, whenever we get kidnapped or something, she's there with, like, a chicken sandwich and hot cocoa to make you feel better. Also, while Terry was held captive in this attic, he found out that Miss Porterly and Miss Wangle are sisters. So he, like, brags to Nancy, and he's like, "See, I'm a detective too." Now, this note that I wrote down, this is my main problem with this book. I said, we're on page 91, and Nancy hasn't even set foot in Mexico or Florida. She's done the bulk of her detective work in River Heights, which I'm thinking, I mean, you know, sometimes she has to do that, but sometimes she has to jet set a little bit. And I was just expecting her to go to Mexico, but she never does. Now, this next note, I said, Terry said Miss Wangle was scared when her husband ran his hands along the black keys of a piano, and Nancy starts to deduce that there's more from these coded notes, and there's a tie-in with the 36 black keys on a piano. And while she's discussing it, George speculates, well, maybe this has to do with the Florida Keys, which I thought this was kind of cool. This was a neat tie-in. My next note says there's a fire at Nancy's next-door neighbor's house, and when she realizes it's too late, she notices and she thinks, oh no, this is a distraction. So she runs into her own house and she sees Juarez Tino, and he's trying to steal the key that Terry gave her. So she fights him off, and he ties her up in her bed sheets. But Nancy thinks she sees the key fall from his pocket. And luckily for her, it does, and George later finds it. Now, this is a key plot point of this book, but Nancy has to pass a test to go on Dr. Anderson's trip to Florida, otherwise he just won't let her go. And so she reads up on the course material, and she passes the test, so she follows a lead on the Black Keys with a man called Two Line Parker, and apparently he got that name because he can handle 2 fishing rods at once, and he tells them about a ship that sank called the Black Falcon. Like, I thought this guy was going to be named Two-Line Parker because he lies in one breath and then he tells the truth in the next or something. But no, he literally can fish like none other. So basically, to sum this book up, Nancy does find the treasure. That was my last note. Now, for the next segment of this podcast, I like to call it What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, and we just discuss some of the things that Nancy's housekeeper likes to bake or make. And Hannah makes Terry some chicken broth and toast when he's like overcome and he's, come out of this attic. And that's the only thing we hear her make, but we also hear Bess makes a lemon meringue pie about halfway through the book. Now, as far as things that Nancy could add to her resume, I put rescuer / Liam Neeson because she, finds out that Terry is up in this attic and the Wangles were keeping him hostage and then they just ran off and left him there. I mean, he could have starved to death. So thankfully, Nancy found him. And then I said picture analyst because she figures out that all the translations that Terry did from the diary add up to make this picture and they show the Florida Keys. So now we're going to discuss the things that I liked about the Clue of the Black Keys and the things I didn't like. So the thing that I said that I liked is that Nancy has a lot of code-breaking skills and she figures out, that the coded notes lead to the Wangles' house. But the things that I didn't like, I thought that this mystery kind of dragged on. And I said, I thought we were going to go to Mexico. I couldn't get over that. I was like, no, we barely even got to go to Florida. We went to Florida in the last 15 pages of the book, so that was a bit disappointing. Or, correction, we do get to go to Mexico, but it's only in the last few pages of the book that we actually make it there. And I don't know about you, but when I'm reading a Nancy Drew book and it's teased that we're going to go to this exotic location, I kind of prefer when it's for at least half of the book or a majority of the book. It's just more fun to me that way. I mean, I read these books sometimes to live vicariously through Nancy. She jet sets and goes around the world, and I kind of like to read the books for that reason. So as far as rating the Clue of the Black Keys, I gave this book a 2 magnifying glass rating because it just wasn't my favorite. There were some moments of suspense and some cool moments, but it just wasn't my favorite book. So yeah, that concludes today's episode on the Clue of the Black Keys. I hope you guys liked it, and if you want to listen next week, we're going to be talking about the mystery of the ski jump. And if you like trips to Montreal and fur trappers and people who impersonate Nancy, then you will definitely like this book. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.